I really think nonprofits need to ask themselves these questions. First one is, will volunteers be adding value to what they do? What kind of unique skills and experiences do they bring? And this can be lived experience, right? As someone who's been a patient, a caregiver, a member of the community. And how can volunteers provide the depth of relationship that staff might not have time for?
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Jessica Pang Parks. Jessica, welcome to What the Fundraising.
Hi, Mallory. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's dive in. Tell everyone a little bit about you, about your work, and then we'll sort of get into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, okay. So, how nonprofits work so hard to build support or trust, but many of them lose it by overlooking the influence that volunteers have. So, that's why nonprofits who give a care call me when they're ready to create impact and inspire belonging through ethical volunteer engagement framework. And the result means genuine community buy in, deeper connections to mission, and you'll love this, more fundraising revenue.
Yes. Okay. Well, I really appreciate that. And I love thinking about sort of the interconnection of community and getting your community involved in multiple ways. We won't go into Giving Tuesday, yes or no right now, but one of the statistics I love around Giving Tuesday is that one of the most uncommon behaviors is people only donating. That's sort of like the
Interesting.
most common behavior is people donating, but the most uncommon behavior is people only donating, which means
Right.
that most people are looking for an additional form of engagement on that day. And I think in particular, but probably more than that day. And that just sort of tells us a little bit about people's appetite to be involved in the organizations they love and support and how deeply that is connected to their giving in a lot of circumstances, in a lot of ways. So that comes with a huge variety of questions. And I feel like, volunteer programs can be a little bit of a hot button issue, particularly when you are talking about it in relationship to fundraising, because
Yeah.
it can create some complicated dynamics. And so, you know me, I like to get right to the heart of the matter. So, can you tell me a little bit about how you think about volunteer programs in relationship to fundraising or the, fundraising department or safeguards that sort of ensure that the volunteer programs aren't being created just to raise money, then at the detriment of community impact?
So I'm actually going to start by quoting one of my mentors. Her name is Erin Spank. She's a thought leader in the space. And she really wants to banish the phrase volunteer program because these are people, right? And yes, volunteers can support your food security program, your mentorship program, your animal fostering program. But what organizations need is to start thinking about volunteer engagement as a strategy, right? We don't have HR programs, we don't have fundraising programs. Like you might, but really, the crux of it and what really makes an impact is a strategy. And strategy is automatically connected to mission, right? So I'm going to quote my former boss, Christine McKernan, who's now retired fundraiser. And we clicked right away because she's like, Jessica, volunteer engagement is not a make work project. You don't just create volunteer roles and experiences to give people something to do in the hopes that they will raise money with you, right? Share your messaging, raise awareness, all of that stuff. So I really think nonprofits need to ask themselves these questions. First one is, will volunteers be adding value to what they do? What kind of unique skills and experiences do they bring? And this can be lived experience, right? As someone who's been a patient, a caregiver, a member of the community. And How can volunteers provide the depth of relationship that staff might not have time for? So, someone who's a registered nurse in a hospital may not have time to have a conversation with a patient and get to know their family and understand and maybe even speak the language that they are most comfortable speaking. But someone who is a volunteer can offer that service. And what I really want nonprofits to know is we need to stop thinking of volunteers as just a way to save money.
Okay, tell me more about what you mean by that.
So there is something called like the wage replacement rate around volunteerism. And I personally am not for it because, first of all, it whittles down volunteers to just numbers, right? That's all about output. It's not about impact. And are you saying that a volunteer who comes in, mentors a young person, and really makes that critical difference in their life is as valuable as someone, the wage replacement rate is exactly the same as someone who hands out water bottles at the fun run, right? And it's not that fun run volunteer wasn't needed. But it's also like you gotta look at your mission. You gotta look the impact that volunteers actually have. And I really encourage folks to look at Sue Carter Call's work on this. She has written an entire PhD thesis about how we can measure volunteer impact beyond the number of volunteers and the number of hours. And it's so important for organizations and funders and donors to understand that volunteers have inherent value. I teach a course on volunteer engagement here in Canada, and I ask my students every semester, would your organization involve volunteers if they had all the money in the world to hire staff? And most of them say yes, because there is an inherent value. There is something about that magic that they bring of they don't have to be there. They're choosing to be there and sharing those other 4 T's of giving, right? Because I know fundraisers, you thinking about treasure, but let's talk about time, talent, ties, and testimony. And without those 4 T's, it's really hard to get the treasure.
So, okay, I so appreciate everything that you're saying here, and I'm trying to think about this and process this in relationship to I'm trying to like tease out that value piece. Because I'm thinking about it actually in terms of corporate social responsibility, and this is kind of a weird bridge, right? Because it's almost like the flip of what you're talking about, right? Is that I am so guilty of this. So I will speak from my own perspective, and I know that I'm not alone where I was trying to build a fundraising relationship with a company. And it felt like the easiest pathway in was through, I know we're laughing at that,
It's
but
okay. It's okay.
it felt like the easiest pathway in, right, was through the CSR department where they were looking for volunteer opportunities. And I had a program where we could easily create those volunteer opportunities. And it wasn't the things that we were asking people to do, it wasn't valuable around the work that they were doing. It was valuable to have volunteers in those roles. It was special, the exchange that was happening. But if I was being honest, it would have been a lot less capacity for me, for the organization to get volunteers elsewhere, right? In the schools where the school gardens were. We had plenty of students who wanted to do those things. And so the creation of that, and I hear you around the no volunteers program, but we're going to go back to when I was using terms like that to say like the creation and sort of curation of that volunteer workday for that company, which also had a lot of value to that company. Oftentimes, I found that companies were asking me for those things, but not attributing any value to that experience either. And so this is where like I feel this complication sort of like in my heart and head around like, yes, I love what you're saying around how do we value volunteers and how do we think about that in terms of all of the T's and all of this sort of like deeper connection. And I'm thinking about sitting on the other side too and like how we navigate and have those conversations with other entities that might have a lot of the tea treasure. And we want them to also value the experience that they're having with us.
Yeah, I love that question. And I totally get it because we live in this world like capitalism, basically, right? Like, this is the system we live in. And unfortunately, we have to operate within it to do our work, right? So, let me give you a few examples of alternatives that I'd like to encourage corporate giving folks to offer on that menu instead of kind of that team volunteering day, right? To come and sort food or paint the wall or garden or whatever, right? So, one example I'll give is I was speaking to a colleague who works at a hospital foundation, and they have partnered with one of the banks that has multiple branches in their city. And that bank, so one of the ways that this hospital foundation raises money and supports the community is they have a cafe within the hospital, right? And that cafe is staffed by volunteers. So what this bank has done is once a week, an employee or a pair of employees will come into that cafe 4 hours at a time. So instead of sending a team of 20 people once a quarter, right? There's ongoing engagement with those bank employees and the organization. And they have that ongoing presence for the hospital community, and they're giving ongoing support to that foundation. So I really love that. And it made it easier for my colleague because it was one shift that they didn't have to worry about. And it was these are bank employees, they know customer service, they come in, they have some training that they do beforehand on the cafe practices, but it's pretty much like something that they can do ongoing for years and years. So, and it's really popular. Another thing that I really like is secondments. So, of employees with specialized skills. So, whether it's IT or accounting, and giving folks like projects that they can do, right? Maybe it's a nonprofit that needs a video about their services. That's something that a marketing team at a corporate could do, right? And if they're given a timeline, a project plan, they're working together with the nonprofit, that is so meaningful and a longer term, more sustained project rather than something that's a one off. And I also want organizations to think, I mean, obviously, I love volunteer engagement. My entire career, corporate engagement is not just volunteer engagement. There is so much that organizations can do. It can be an education session. So I worked at the Heart and Stroke Foundation here in Canada. That could be a session where employees learn CPR, right? Maybe they use those CPR skills to do what we call informal volunteering. Informal volunteering is, a volunteer role that you don't apply for. It's just about being a good citizen, helping your neighbors, right? And that could be something like knowing CPR, carrying an naloxone kit. It can also be something like retweeting information about an organization or raising awareness about something around their mission, right? It could be sending a guest speaker or someone with lived experience to the corporate headquarters to give a talk and engage folks that way. It could be a book club. It could be let's watch this TED talk and have a chat about this issue that we're tackling in our community, whether it's homelessness or it's violence against women, whatever it is, right? And that's another way to engage volunteers, right? From the community to work with the corporate and gives the corporate real value to their employees.
Okay, I love the different ways of thinking about this. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is the nonprofit sort of standing, like asking these really critical questions ahead of time. And as you were saying things, like I felt my own, like, oh, not every company is going to go for that. And it's like, yeah, you're right. And like, that's okay. Like asking these questions, if what you're really trying to do is number one, make sure that these programs are providing real value and feel good to everybody involved, then it really does start with these questions shaping and forming how you design these pieces. So I really appreciate that orientation. And I sort of say that to everybody else, maybe who is like, yes, butting it, to say, like, yeah, like sometimes when we think differently about how we've done things, it means that not every type of partnership or not every type of thing fits anymore. And that's okay because we're making these decisions and these changes based on the priorities of how we're trying to do things moving forward.
And it's got to be aligned with mission, right? Like, I'll give you an example that I think fundraisers are really going to understand. So imagine a corporation comes to you and you're working for an organization that supports unhoused people. So you make a call out for clothing donations, and a corporation comes to you and they say, hey, we've got some great clothing donations. We'd love to give them to you. And you're like, okay, what are they? Can you send me a few samples? And what you get is bikinis and clubwear, right? It's essentially the same thing. What would you do in that instance if the corporation is is offering something that does not align with your mission? Right. And you go to them and you're like, no, we're actually looking for like underwear and sweaters and socks. And they're like, yeah, no, 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 but we really want to give you bikinis and clubwear. Like when you
Yeah,
think about it that way and you
totally.
equate it to an offer of time and talent.
Totally. And you're like, what do you do? Do you like open a like storage facility for the bikinis? Like, right. Exactly. It makes it very clear.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's this other piece I really want to make sure we have time to talk about because when I was reading about your work, one of the things that I really loved was this focus on staff capacity, which you've touched on a little bit in how you've talked about things. But oftentimes, and this happens with fundraising too, like I'll get on a call with a potential client or I'll be with somebody on a, alignment fundraising call and they'll be like, oh, well, a consultant told us like the best way to fundraise is like blank. And I'm like, okay, like cool, but you are a team of one and
Yeah.
you're also in charge of the program and you're also like this. And so, like, is that a good way to fundraise? Absolutely. Does it make any sense for your current capacity? Not at all. So I'm
Right.
curious, like when I saw that on your piece and just like, I think that's another thing that often like get swept or like not centralized enough in the decision making here is like around team capacity. So, what are some of the ways you help folks think through their true, real, actual capacity to do certain types of volunteer engagement?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is advocate for my profession because I've been on teams where there are literally hundreds of fundraising professionals, and there's me and one other person on the volunteer engagement team. So I want to note to fundraisers that like don't assume anyone can fill the capacity for engaging volunteers. We actually like have a credential out there. It's called the CVA. It's very similar to the CFRE, right? There's a credential out there. I teach a college program that, teaches these things. And it's the same as as someone applying for a fundraiser job and being like, well, I raised $100 for the fund run from my family and friends. So I know how to raise major gifts. I know how to do legacy giving. I know how to do annual giving, monthly giving. I know how to do direct mail. Like, this is a honed skill set that many of us are really passionate about. And I really encourage, if you have volunteer engagement folks at your organization, have more conversation and connection with them. Because to be very honest, Mallory, I've been treated very poorly by fundraisers in my career. Like calling me up 2 days before a golf tournament and being like, Jessica, I need 50 volunteers at this golf tournament. And I'd be like, well, this is a 6-week process. Can you start by drafting this volunteer role description? Because a lot of folks in the nonprofit sector have this misconception that the first step of volunteer engagement is recruitment. No, the first step is planning. And when volunteer engagement is done well, you don't have a volunteer bank. You don't just have frozen volunteers that you can like pull out of your desk drawer and defrost and send to a golf tournament. Like that doesn't work. If you want people who are the right fit, who are going to be there to supplement the staff in stewarding important relationships, you really need to collaborate, genuinely collaborate with, and trust volunteer engagement professionals. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I'm going to say is really like, I think you saw my video on this because I think you alluded to it, is yes, volunteer engagement takes money. That's another thing that people forget. It's like volunteers aren't free. Volunteer engagement isn't free. It takes money. Like you need someone there to put together the processes to plan, recruit, train, orient, onboard, supervise, recognize, and steward, just like the donor engagement cycle. There is a very, very process driven, but also relationship driven cycle. And it's not easy. So I think that's another thing that folks need to think about. And yes, once you put in the money, there's also time that's involved. So I would say that like, this is where we need to take a page from our project management colleagues and really like, I always recommend a RACI chart. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed, right? And how does the fundraising team and the volunteer engagement professionals and marketing and finance and all teams across the organization work together on a project?
Okay. Okay. Whoa. First of all, thank you for sharing about your experience. And I'm so sorry to hear how you've been treated in this role or like in the role of a volunteer engagement coordinator. And as you were saying it, like my kind of like heart sank a little bit around the fact that like I can't imagine how hard that was for you to experience and to sort of be treated in that transactional way of like all the things that fundraisers also hate, right? Like
Yeah.
being on the other side of. And it highlights for me the dynamic like stress, like the way in which we pass stress to each other, right? And the like donor that called angry at that fundraiser about the golf tournament just turned into the stress that fundraiser pushed to you around getting those volunteers to show up. And I'm not excusing that behavior in any way. I'm just sort of seeing how these dynamics like just go round and round in these environments driven by these sort of transactional, metrics rooted in scarcity, which goes to your point around like these things cost money and why are we doing this in the first place? And so I think it's, even as you were saying certain things, I was like, wow, that piece around planning, right? For so many small organizations, this was absolutely true for my organization. That step did not happen. And to your point, we had a program, we had a need for volunteers in that program. And every time we needed those volunteers, we would blast out to our whole list for people to come to this volunteer day. Now, was that an ideal volunteer engagement thing? No, but we were a really small organization where I was the person talking to every donor and to every volunteer and running that garden workday. And so there was none of what you talked about, but there also wasn't nothing because of how small we were. And so one of the things I'm wondering, because I know you work with organizations of all sizes, and so I'm thinking about that really small organization who can't hire a volunteer like coordinator yet, who are maybe years away from that, but really do have a great opportunity in their programs to bring volunteers in. They know that those opportunities alone create meaningful experiences. They want to invite their community members in those moments. Like, is that okay? Or are you sort of saying, like, unless you can really go through these steps and do this right, you shouldn't really start it. You shouldn't really do it that way.
Oh, that's a hard question because did you know in Canada, most of the organizations that exist, whether they're grassroots or they're registered, like they are mostly volunteer run. So I'm talking like the working board model of like you're the board member, but you're also the person updating the website, right? You're also booking these things, right? So I get it, right? And like every organization has volunteers because your board members are volunteers. I really think I'm going to recommend a resource. It actually just came out in November. It's called the Equity in Action Toolkit, and it's free for everyone to go to. Folks should be able to find it on the Volunteer Match website. And it was created by folks who have the CVA credential to really get organizations to think about these questions and think about why they're working with volunteers. And also, just on the language of language, please never say use volunteers. We engage volunteers. They're people. We use things. We do not use people. And I know you've had Brianna Doralis on the show before, and she does a lot of amazing work on this. So, yeah, just really like think about equity. And sometimes you do need volunteers, but like I wouldn't create volunteer roles because there is that scarcity mindset, right? We lost our funding for this. So let's just make it a volunteer role. Let's make do with that. Volunteers should never replace staff. That is completely unethical. And I think that's why, like, volunteers and staff are sometimes pitted against each other because staff are afraid, hey, if this person with these competencies comes in, I might lose my job because they're willing to do it for free. But that means the volunteer engagement strategy at that organization was poorly designed because volunteers should never replace staff. And, as we talk through these power dynamics within teams, I've noticed you said volunteer engagement coordinator multiple times, right? So, to be honest, at most organizations, that is the ceiling. It's not even a glass ceiling. I've called it an iron ceiling, right? I made it up to the director level, but I, again, saw hundreds of roles on the fundraising team being able to move in different parts of fundraising, where on my team, it was a straight line. And most organizations, coordinator's the cutoff, specialist is the cutoff, right? And again, volunteer engagement is hard work. It's not just about recruiting. There's an entire cycle very similar to the donor stewardship cycle. And so much of our work is actually project management and influencing without authority. So, like, I guess going back to your question, I really think when organizations, those small organizations, really need that volunteer support, first of all, trust and transparency with the community, right? Right now, we need your support. We would love to hire someone full time to do this work, right? And making sure every role has a role description, making sure there are policies for volunteers, making sure that there are codes of conduct. But with role description, codes of conduct, and policies, I had a colleague in HR and they said to me, well, we can just take what we do with staff and copy it over. There's a nuance that's very different with volunteers, right? And, again, speaking up for my profession, you can't just take what you have somewhere else and copy it over. There are lots of nuances that there are specialists in this field who know how to do that work. There are great templates out there. The Equity in Action Toolkit has some great stuff. My former employer, Volunteer Toronto, has some great templates out there. But don't just do that if everything's going well with HR, you can copy it over for volunteer engagement. Take the time, do the hard work, specializing in that work. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I could ask you like 45 more questions about it, but I want to be respectful of your time. And I think folks are going to leave this. I mean, I'm learning a lot. Like, I feel
Oh,
like
well,
this
thank
is
you.
something I wish I had heard 20 years ago. So I just want to, like, I'm in this conversation reflecting on so many things I did wrong or
The internet's
probably
off again.
inequitably or and didn't even really have any type like just sort of it's such a reminder of like the way we can just start to model things after what we think are the good versions of it and find ourselves think that we're doing the quote unquote right thing. And because we never took a step back and asked some of these big questions. So I really appreciate you sharing and for advocating. I mean, I feel like when I started my work like in 2021, I felt very much in the seat you're sitting in for fundraisers, right? Like I and feeling like, in the organizations they weren't being advocated for and they were so siloed and devalued and everybody was like, "Well, I'm not a fundraiser." And there was so much stigma around their role and they were ostracized. And so like I had a lot of that same passion around like, hey. And so I think it's really important for fundraisers to hear this and to have this sort of like reflection. And I really appreciate you sharing so vulnerably. I want to
Thank
encourage
you.
folks who are like leaving this, like, okay, I still have lots of questions. Like, where can they go to learn more from you, to stay connected, to work with you, all the things?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, learnwithjpp.com, or they can find me on LinkedIn. And I think you're linking to my Instagram, which is also Learn with JPP. So, yeah, I really want to have these conversations because, to be honest, I found a lot of great fundraiser allies in the community centric fundraising movement. And just to remind everybody who's familiar with that, right? The value number 5 of community centric fundraising is time is equally valued as money. So I really think like when I have conversations with folks who are connected to that movement and believe in it, they get what I'm saying. And it's okay. We all have to learn and grow and like we are part of this system and this sector that is rooted in colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy. So it's not like, these harms just come out of nowhere. Right. But I think it's really time to start having those uncomfortable conversations. And I'm really thankful that you invited me to have this one with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this brings me back. I don't know why I feel like I'm going to cry right now, but I do.
Oh,
Um,
Mallory.
no, in a good way, like in a good way. I love that I can access my emotions like so closely. Crying is not a bad thing to me at all. But I think I feel particularly like tender around this because it just keeps going back to this thing I always am sitting with, which is like, how are we defining like it works, right? We're like, oh, do this fundraising thing because it works. We do this volunteer thing because it works. And it's like works because of the system that we live in, because of capitalism, because of patriarchy, because of white supremacy culture. Works is often actually in direct conflict with like who we're trying to be and what we're trying to build. And that is such an uncomfortable position to sit in, to like feel like the world around you defines works in one way and you exist to try to change that system. And yet everyone is evaluating whether or not your thing works based on that same system. And then for us, we adopt it. And I think what you're asking people to do, which I really value, is to say, take a step back and like redefine what does it look like for your volunteer engagement, for the volunteer people that you have the opportunity to engage in your organization in these ways. What does it look like? What does it really look like in alignment with your values and in alignment with who you want to be for that strategy or plan to quote unquote work?
Yeah. And I don't have all the answers, Mallory. I think like we're all navigating this together. And I just hope more people come into community with us to have these conversations and to find solutions together and share successes and to celebrate them. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you so much again for this conversation and for joining me today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Take care, Mallory.